and welcome to the Gay Liberation Network here on Chicago Access Network Television. I'm your host, Andy Thayer, and with me tonight is Roberto Ferreira of the Chicago Committee for Justice in Ayotzinapa. Ayotzinapa, for those who don't know, was a town in Mexico where some 43 students, quote-unquote, disappeared about 3 years ago now, yes?
This is, unfortunately.
Yes, yeah. And what is striking about the case of the 43 is that this was one disappearance of thousands. You were telling me before the show, Roberto, how many thousands have
in
disappeared?
12 years of, in the past two governments, we have in Mexico around 200,000 people died because of violence, and 40,000 people disappear because the violence and political issues, not only for the narco traffic. Narco traffic was just the justification to do certain things, no? It's it's a kind of a game, just the pretext to disappear people and make certain politics, certain, it's like when you are playing with some pieces, you can put one here, another here, and in one shot you can kill all the...
Well, and obviously anyone who's been paying attention to the news knows that Chicago violence has been very much in the news. And as you saw from the opening, we're going to be talking about 1968 in Mexico and here in Chicago, and the relevance of the lessons learned from what happened in 1968. But before we do launch into the conversation, I should note that telephone number at the bottom of your screen. That's if you want to call in and ask Roberto a question or make a very short comment. You can call in once we're ready in that part of the show. That's that number at the bottom of your screen, 312-738-1060. But before we get into that, I'd like to get up on your screen some information about a very important event happening later this month here in the city. Sorry for those of you who are watching on Facebook Live, you can't see this on your screen. 50 years ago, at the end of this month, is the anniversary of the infamous Chicago Democratic Convention. This was a convention that saw the Democratic Party stalwarts, such as Mayor Richard J. Daley, ramrod through a pro-war candidate inside the convention hall in spite of 80% of Democratic Party primary voters saying they were in favor of a so-called peace candidate. And yet they rammed through a pro-war candidate, and outside in the streets you had huge protests that were violently put down by Mayor Daley's cops. And so we've got this event coming up here, Unite Against War and Police Violence, which is coming up on Saturday, August 25th. There's a picture from '68. This is a picture here coming up your screen. That's Yemen. Just yesterday, a massacre of dozens of children by U.S. bombs dropped by Saudi. It's apparently a missile launched by the Saudis, but all these weapons, provided by the United States. Again, the violence that we saw in 1968 is unfortunately, on a world scale, certainly very much with us. And so we've got this event coming up, appropriately enough, 12 noon Saturday, August 25th at Richard J. Daley Plaza here in Chicago, 12 noon Saturday, August 25th. And we'll get that announcement up on the screen again in a few minutes. Roberto, a lot of people don't know this, but there was a horrible massacre right in the heart of Mexico City, just days before the 1968 Mexico City Olympics. And I understand that we were discussing a little bit earlier, there were a few precursor demonstrations, students who were celebrating the victory of the Fidel Castro's movement to overthrow the Batista
in July
dictatorship.
26.
Yeah.
There were two demonstrations, one for for the Cuban Revolution, and the other were protesting because the violence of the police against the students. But you know what? As soon the students start protesting for in the July 26, they were the repression was very hard. That starts the resistance of the students, and little by little, the resistance was growing up, and the violence of the police were worst.
And you can see
In every demonstration, the police were very, very, very hard against the students.
Well, those of you who are watching on the television screen, this is a screen showing a demonstration in early August, where, I should say early October in Mexico City. And people flooded in the streets in response to the shutdown of the university. Again, apologies to those of you watching on Facebook Live. You can't see this, but this plaza in downtown Mexico, and the name of it again for
Tlatelolco, Plaza de las Tres Culturas, Plaza de Tlatelolco.
And this was also the scene of a massacre by the invading Spaniards, literally centuries prior. And so this same plaza witnessed the murder of, by many accounts, several hundred students.
Yeah, more or less 450 years before there was another massacre for the Spaniards against the Tlatelolcans, the people that used to live there.
And just moving on, narrate some of these pictures for us, please, Roberto. We're showing, for those of us who can't see on the screen here, we've got a picture of a tank right in the middle of that.
That was in the Zócalo, in the main plaza of Mexico City, because the student movement not only was the day of the repression in October 2nd, that was a few months from June, July, August, September, and practically the end, the big repression was in October the 2nd. And then after in the plaza, there was a huge meeting for people were to demonstrating and very angry because all the violence, the police and even the army, the army was showing against the students and against the people, because this movement was not only for students. Little by little, other people from the unions,
sectors, yes.
sectors of the society were attaching to the movement.
Well, and this is very common, you see, in revolutionary movements, where sometimes it'll be sparked by smaller groups of people, whether students or street vendors or what have you, but then other sectors of society, women or unionists or whomever, start coming out in solidarity. We saw this in the Iranian Revolution that overthrew the Shah of Iran, again another U.S.-backed dictator. The pre-government at the time made little attempt to hide that it was basically a dictatorship. And again, for those of you who are watching on Facebook Live, I apologize, but we've got on the screen here a armored personnel carrier. And for those of us who live in this country, who grew up in this country, the thought of seeing, say, armored personnel carriers on the mall in D.C., that's how traumatic this was for people living in Mexico City at the time. And here you see the kind of brutality that was meted out in all these people on the ground. They're clearly not resisting, and yet the police are wailing away with their clubs with impunity. And here you see a picture of students stripped and
Right
forced
after
to,
the massacre.
right after the massacre. If you look closely at the ground there, you see pools of blood from God knows how many people who've been killed just in that one spot. And
The witnesses say that more or less 300 people, not only students, even the kids, people from the, they were just sympathetic with them, that they showed the solidarity. 300 people, more or less, were the consequence of this massacre.
yeah. Now, Roberto, it's not like this was like a mystery that this happened. I mean, it was witnessed by probably tens of thousands of people, including apparently reporters for the American ambassador in Mexico. And yet, in spite of all those literally thousands of witnesses, there was a big cover-up. Could you say a few words about that, please?
Yeah, okay, the first thing is Mexico in that time was the middle class were buoyant middle class. They were escalating in the social issues and for Mexico was I think the time for the economics were growing up and more or less certain stability, but still, now we know that, for example, the president and the other ministries, they were working for the CIA. For example, the president that left, Gustavo Díaz Ordaz, in that moment of the 68, the 68 movement, next president that after Díaz Ordaz was Echeverría, and Echeverría was called Nintempo, was the name of the secret name for the CIA. That means even Mexican presidents they were working for the CIA. They
Well,
were
and
secret
arguably,
agents.
the CIA was working for the Mexican president because
Of course.
the ambassador knew about this. There was actually a secret film, I understand, that came out several years ago that was taken by the U.S. Agents of the U.S., people of the embassy, or what have you, that the U.S. sat on while pretending that very little had happened in this square just days before the 1968 Mexico Olympics. I'd like to switch on your screen here because we're talking about Mexico and Chicago 1968. And fortunately, while there was no one killed at the 1968 Chicago Democratic Convention, in fact, whether very nearly could have been given the level of brutality, the impunity with which the authorities acted, the police as well as their political superiors, nothing happened to them after all this violence they unleashed. Here you see the welcome Democrats to Chicago, okay? But this is what the street presented to people who were in Chicago at the time. National Guardsmen with rifles, often with fixed bayonets. This is Richard J. Daley, who in the process of ramming through a pro-war candidate, even though the vast majority of people said that they don't want a pro-war candidate in the primaries at least. Here's one of the demonstrations. In fact, this is right near where our demonstration this year is going to be ending, right by the General John Logan statue in Grant Park, and in the background there you can see the Hilton Hotel where many of the delegates stayed. Again here, fixed bayonets and pointing at the demonstrators who were opposed to violence here. You can see what appears to be tear gas in the background there. Again, down by the Hilton and Field Museum in the background there. Again, the police deciding that they're going to clear the park in this instance violently if need be. Again, wanton violence by the Chicago police. They were attacking not just demonstrators, they were attacking journalists, passers-by, and this here this image right here is probably, I think, one of the most infamous pictures of the Chicago '68 Democratic Convention. You see that officer with his hand on his billy club, waiting to just crash it down on the head of the person taking this picture. Armed with a camera, he's going up against a person, a Chicago police officer, with that billy club. I think that speaks volumes. And of course, nothing ever happened to that police officer, I'm sure. This here you see one of the journalists talking to one of the demonstrators, both of them bloodied. The journalist with the wrapping around his head from a previous injury here. And I think it speaks volumes about what we saw in Mexico City, the impunity with which the Army attacked the demonstrators, and here in Chicago. And
I think we are talking about two very important issues for the system. In Chicago, you know, the guns, or in United States, the guns business is a big business.
Right.
And I think in that time that the anti-war and all the movement that were demonstrating against the war, there was a real danger for this industry, no? And then, you know, it's a business. They have to let the business run. And I think all the people, they don't care about the violence. They want to, everybody stay quiet and they don't say nothing.
Just don't bring the violence down to the Magnificent Mile, I think is the attitude. It stays on the west side or parts of the south
because
side.
for the government of the you know, the people in the power, they always said that people is violent. If you demonstrate in the streets, that is violence for them, but not the police hitting people. You know,
or the wholesale deprivation of resources. You look at how the west side and much of the south side has been created with the systematic deprivation of resources, whether you're talking about mental health clinics, schools, libraries, and of course jobs, where TIF monies are used to support private businesses, funds that were ostensibly set up to help fight poverty instead further enrich the already wealthy. And I think that you saw with the Lakeshore Drive protest the other day, that was really one of the central issues of that, is the funneling of monies to already wealthy parts of the city to the detriment of places that are already poor. And those sort of issues are what we're going to be talking about on August 25th, that it's not just the violence of the police, not just intercommunal violence, but frankly the violence of economic deprivation, which causes some people to flip out. Or in Mexico, when you can't have jobs because of the effects of NAFTA wiping out agriculture in rural areas, people need jobs, and the drugs trade fills that gap.
Yeah, and in that moment, the middle class were, I mean, more or less wealthy. That was, but of course, in the countryside, that was even in that time, the country was more or less one balance in terms of they were growing up in the economics. But of course, I think they were preparing for after 1988. With the elections 30 years ago, that was the first time that where the people tried to change the government and to change and make a big change in Mexico, and the establishment they weren't going to allow that happen. So, and then after in 3 years, all the neoliberalism politics were implanted in Mexico in terms of really hard conditions to the country.
Privatization, I mean,
everything.
We've seen that here in Chicago, where any number of groups of city workers that were formerly done by unionized folks who could speak up on the job if need be, if something's going wrong. You see, for example, the
Privatizing schools.
janitors services in the schools was privatized, and these wealthy corporations that make big bucks off of, for example, the prison industry.
It's a mirror. The same thing. The same thing that they even maybe they started earlier there because 20 years ago, 21 or 22 years ago, when I came to Chicago to live in Chicago, I think in Chicago have a lot of still have a lot of privileges in terms of social things. You know, clinics for rehabilitation, things like that. Now is gone.
Well, a lot of that was won by the movement of the 1960s because the federal dollars came fast and furious when they were afraid of rebellions in the cities. I mean, as we saw in the response to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And because there has not been the same kind of systemic protest and also the independence of the movements, and I think this is so important, the independence of the movements from both political parties means that the movement can be treated as just a plaything of one of the other parties rather than the movement itself saying to both the Democrats and Republicans that if you don't give us what we demand, then we're going to screw things up for you. I mean, that was, I think, one of the biggest things that came out of the Chicago '68 convention was that people knew that the Republican presidential nominee, Richard Nixon, was a creep and a racist and a crook. They knew he was called Tricky Dick. That renowned as Tricky Dick.
Nice name.
And so people had that were in favor just had no illusions in him. People who wanted to end the Vietnam War had no illusions in him. But they had illusions in the Democrats. And then when Richard J. Daley, who was one of the biggest Democrats around, said, it's my way or the highway, I'm going to choose my candidate for the party, and I'm going to club you in the streets of Chicago if you don't like it. That was a wake-up call to the anti-war movement. It was a wake-up call to people that they can't depend on either political party, and they need to make the change themselves. And in the history of the next few years, in terms of the burgeoning of the women's movement, the gay movement, the Black Power movement, and so forth, and the ending of the Vietnam War, the first time in U.S. history that a war has been ended before the exhaustion of one or both sides. That's something I think we have to learn from today. That's something we have to learn from today because we have got endless wars going today. You saw the picture of the woman and her child. Actually, sorry, that's a Facebook post that I did earlier, but there was I posted earlier today a woman and a child in Gaza who were slaughtered this morning by an Israeli
I think
airstrike.
the world is claiming for USA, please stop to export your democracy.
And your weapons.
The American democracy caused a lot of
So-called democracy.
so a lot of people dying all around the world
Yeah.
since
Yeah.
100 years or more. No, for example, in Mexico, we have a the pretext in '68 for the massacre was because I think the president and the government they were afraid to don't have the opportunity they couldn't stop the movement, and they said
So they were repressive. Well, and that's apparently how Richard J. Daley felt. And I think it's a signal lesson that when their power is challenged, they will use any means fair and foul to repress it. If they can maintain democratic niceties, they will. But they will not give up their power. And so for those, for example, trying to take over the Democratic Party, I say this to the Bernistas, look at your history. Look at how they reacted in 1968 to the attempted takeover of their party by pro-peace forces. And look at, actually just 4 years later, the whole McGovern movement, when they did nominate they did succeed in pushing back the old guard. The old guard completely abandoned the Democratic Party and became the best Republicans, and Richard Nixon was ushered in what up until that point had been the largest landslide in U.S. electoral history, that you can't take over their state institutions and just run them for yourselves, that they will use any means possible, no matter how undemocratic, no matter how unconstitutional, to protect their powers. Those pictures from Mexico City or Chicago showed.
Yeah, that is. I mean, the consequence in Mexico have a, you know, after the big repression in October 2nd, all the leaders, the students that were leading the movement, they were in jail. They were, you know, torture, jail, a lot of prosecution against all the people. And then finally they celebrate the Olympic Games like nothing happens, no?
Yeah.
All the world was there, and no one country say protesting against the massacre.
The only protests were the track athletes, the black track athletes who saved the honor of those games by doing so, and they faced heavy repression for doing that. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our time here tonight, and I'd like to give a warm thanks to Roberto Ferreira of the Chicago Committee for Justice in Yotzinapa. Roberto, tell people how they can get in touch with the committee, please.
Okay, you can find us in Facebook.
Okay.
It's Comité de Justicia por Ayotzinapa, and we are doing and publishing in the Facebook page all the information that is happening in Mexico about that. Even with the new government that is coming in Mexico, we have our hope is to at least to know what happened with these students. It's really
And the violence
crime against the humanity, no?
Yeah.
And then we still we're looking for them.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, and with that, I'd like to again just announce very quickly the big demonstration coming up at the end of the month here, Saturday, August 25th, Unite Against War and Police Violence. That's going to be starting at Richard J. Daley Plaza, and coming up on your screen there, 12 noon at Saturday the 25th at Richard J. Daley Plaza. And with that, thank you very much for watching. And just closing out with a few messages of thanks to those who helped make tonight's show possible.